The Adventure of the Bleeding Mask. B. Chakraborty. Intro. The Crimson Prelude. A foggy night in London. The dim light of gas lamps barely pierces the shroud of mist hanging over the cobbled streets. In a secluded corner of Passage Alley, the police stumble upon a chilling scene. A lifeless body lies sprawled, no blood, no visible wounds. But what sends shivers down their spines is the porcelain mask placed over the victim's face. The mask is pristine white, but crimson tears streak its cheeks, as though the mask itself weeps blood. Beneath it, a note scrawled in jagged handwriting reads, "The color of guilt is crimson." This macabre discovery sends waves of panic through London's elite. Whispers spread like wildfire that the mask carries a curse, and those who come into contact with it cannot escape death. Alaric Drake, the finest detective of the Victorian era, is called to solve the mystery. His assistant, the sharp and determined Jonathan Harker, initially views the case as just another bizarre crime. But Drake's seasoned instincts warn him of something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. "Jonathan," Drake says, taking a contemplative puff from his pipe, "this isn't merely a murder. It's a game. A deadly game where both the hunter and the hunted know the stakes. The question is, can we end it before the clock runs out?" As Drake and Harker dive deeper into the mystery, every clue unravels a darker secret. Each new mask and every cryptic message lead them further into a tangled web of deception and fear. Is this the work of a deranged killer, or is it part of a larger conspiracy? Can Drake uncover the truth, or will the crimson tears of the mask become his own story one day? With every page, you'll find suspense, terror, and a gripping mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The Adventure of the Bleeding Mask is not just a story, it's a challenge. Are you ready to face it? Chapter 1. The Crimson Prelude. London, 1887. The city's veins pulsed with the rhythm of industrial progress, but its heart remained shadowed by secrets. Fog, thick and suffocating, draped the streets in a veil of uncertainty. Gas lamps cast faint halos of light, but even their flicker seemed reluctant to pierce the night. Somewhere in the depths of the city, a cry had gone unanswered, swallowed by the labyrinth of cobbled alleys and decaying brickwork. At 26A, Montague Street, Detective Alaric Drake reclined in his worn armchair. A plume of smoke spiraled lazily from his pipe, adding to the air of quiet contemplation that filled his study. Bookshelves groaned under the weight of tomes on criminology, philosophy, and obscure histories. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth battling the damp chill that seemed to seep through the city's very bones. Drake's repose was interrupted by a sudden, insistent knock at the door. Rising slowly, he opened it to find his assistant, Jonathan Harker, standing there, visibly shaken. The young man's face was pale, his usual composed demeanor replaced by an air of unease. "Drake," Jonathan began, stepping inside. "There's been a murder. And this," he held out a folded note, "was found at the scene." Drake took the paper and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, the ink smudged as though written in haste. The words struck like a blade. "The bleeding mask sees all. Justice shall be painted in red. One has fallen. Many more will follow. Where was this found?" Drake asked, his sharp eyes scanning the note. "Street Giles," Jonathan replied. "The victim was discovered in a back alley, wearing a mask that appeared to bleed." Drake's brow furrowed. "A mask that bleeds. Fascinating. Fetch my coat." The carriage ride to St. Giles was tense. Neither man spoke, the weight of the note hanging heavy in the air. As they arrived, the scene was already bustling with constables trying, and failing, to maintain order. A small crowd had gathered, their murmurs thick with fear and morbid curiosity. Drake and Harker pushed through the throng. The alley was narrow, its walls slick with grime. The body lay sprawled amidst the refuse, illuminated by the weak glow of a gas lamp. The mask on the victim's face was grotesque, porcelain painted with vivid streaks of red that dripped unnervingly, almost as though the mask itself bled. Drake crouched beside the body, his practiced eyes scanning for details. The victim's clothes suggested wealth, but his hands bore the calluses of a man accustomed to labor. Tucked into his inner coat pocket, Drake found a sealed envelope. Breaking the red wax seal, he read the contents aloud. "The first of many. Beware the mask that bleeds. What do you make of it?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Drake didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the mask, noting the fine craftsmanship and a peculiar mark etched near its edge, a serpent coiled around a dagger. "This isn't random," Drake finally said. "The message, the mask, the symbol, it's all deliberate. Someone wants to be found, but only on their terms." As Jonathan took notes, a constable approached. "Beg pardon, sir," he said, "but we found this just down the alley." He handed Drake a piece of fabric, torn and smeared with what appeared to be blood. Drake turned it over in his hands. The fabric was fine, likely part of a cloak, and bore a faint perfume, jasmine, unmistakable and out of place in the filth of St. Giles. "It seems our phantom has a flair for theatrics," Drake murmured, "and a taste for irony." Returning to Montague Street, Drake couldn't shake the image of the bleeding mask. It wasn't just a clue, it was a statement. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and Drake was determined to learn the rules before more blood was spilled. As he lit his pipe and leaned back into his chair, the note sat on the table before him, its words echoing in his mind. The bleeding mask had spoken. The hunt had begun. Chapter 2, A Note of Guilt. The morning fog curled like a ghostly shroud outside the windows of 26A, Montague Street, muffling the city's usual clamor. Inside, Alaric Drake sat at his desk, the note found at the crime scene clutched in his hand. Its words, scrawled in uneven, jagged letters, seemed to almost hiss their meaning. The first of many, "Beware the mask that bleeds." Drake's face was unreadable, his sharp eyes fixed on the words as though they might yield a deeper truth if stared at long enough. The silence was broken by the soft clink of a teacup as Jonathan Harker entered, carrying a tray. "Tea, Drake," Jonathan offered, his tone lighter than his expression. He placed the tray on the desk, then leaned closer to peer at the note. "That handwriting, it feels desperate. Almost manic." "Desperate, yes. But deliberate," Drake murmured, not looking up. His fingers traced the edges of the note as though they might unlock a secret hidden in the creases. "The phrasing is precise. Our phantom isn't merely leaving messages. They are weaving a tale, one thread at a time. And the city is their stage." Before Harker could respond, a sharp knock startled them both. Jonathan opened the door to find Constable Grant standing there, his face pale despite the brisk morning air. "Detective Drake," Grant began, stepping inside with a nervous glance around, "there's been another note. It was found pinned to the door of Lord Abernethy's estate. Pinned with this." Grant held up a cloth-wrapped object, which he carefully unwrapped to reveal a dagger. Its blade was gleaming and cruelly sharp, but it was the hilt that drew Drake's attention, polished ivory engraved with the same serpent coiled around a dagger that adorned the mask. Drake took the weapon, examining it closely. "The symbol again," he murmured, his voice carrying a mix of intrigue and unease. "Our phantom is leaving breadcrumbs, but to what end?" Grant handed over the note found with the dagger. Drake unfolded it with care, revealing more jagged writing. "To those who thrive on others' blood, the mask watches. The truth shall stain your hands as it has mine." Jonathan read the words aloud, his voice low. "It sounds like a vendetta. But why Abernethy? Perhaps his wealth, his influence, or something far darker," Drake replied. He stood abruptly, tossing his coat over his shoulders. "We're going to Mayfair. I want to see this for myself." The grandeur of Lord Abernethy's estate seemed almost mocking in the face of the terror that now surrounded it. Abernethy himself greeted them in his study, his usual bravado replaced by visible anxiety. "Detective Drake," Abernethy began, his voice trembling. This threat is madness. Surely, you don't think it's serious?" Drake's piercing gaze met Abernethy's. "Madness, my lord, often hides in plain sight. But threats of this nature are rarely hollow. Tell me, have you wronged anyone, recently or in the distant past, who might seek vengeance?" Abernethy hesitated, his hand drifting toward the decanter of brandy on the side table. He poured himself a glass with shaking hands, the liquid slushing dangerously close to the rim. "There was an incident," he admitted reluctantly. "Many years ago. A business deal, less than savory. But it was resolved. I thought it forgotten." "Clearly, it was not," Drake said coldly. "I'll need the names of everyone involved in that transaction." Abernethy scribbled a list on a scrap of paper, his reluctance evident in every movement. Drake pocketed it, his expression hardening as his eyes flicked to the dagger displayed on the desk. As they left the estate, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The weight of unseen eyes followed them through Mayfaire's pristine streets. "Drake," Jonathan said, his voice hushed. "Do you feel it? Like we're being observed?" Drake lit his pipe, the tiny flame casting eerie shadows across his face. "That, Jonathan, is precisely the point. Our phantom wants us to feel their presence, to second-guess every move. Fear is their weapon, and they wield it with skill." As they approached 26A Montague Street, a faint sound reached their ears, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried by the wind. Jonathan froze, his hand instinctively going to his revolver. "What was that?" he asked, his voice tight. Drake didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the fog-drenched street. Finally, he turned to Jonathan, his voice low and steady. "A message, Jonathan. One meant for us. The game has only just begun." The note, the dagger, and the mask were pieces of a puzzle far darker than either man could have anticipated. And somewhere in the depths of London's shadows, the Phantom Whisperer was already planning their next move. Chapter 3. The Unseen Thread. The dim light of the flickering gas lamps outside the tavern cast long shadows across the cobblestones as Alaric Drake and Jonathan Harker delved into the mysterious circumstances surrounding the bleeding mask. The chill of the night air mirrored the unease growing in their minds. Their investigation had already taken unexpected twists, but the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Drake leaned back in his chair at their favorite meeting spot, the Hollow Crown, and spread out a collection of documents and newspaper clippings he had amassed. "Look here," he said, tapping a faded invitation card. "This was found in the study of the barrister, Mr. Graves, who vanished. And this," he held up a similar card found at the merchant's estate, "is nearly identical. The emblem, a coiled serpent encircling a bleeding mask, is no coincidence." Jonathan peered closely, his brow furrowed. "A secret society," he ventured. Drake nodded grimly. "It seems so. The victims, Graves and the merchant, were more than just upstanding citizens. Both held influence in sectors that could alter the fortunes of powerful men. This organization, whatever it is, appears to be targeting individuals with connections to specific industries." Jonathan leaned forward. "But why? What's the motive?" Drake steepled his fingers. "Control, perhaps. Fear. Or something even darker. This emblem isn't just a mark, it's a message. A warning." The next morning, the duo made their way to the barrister's deserted office, now shrouded in a layer of dust. Despite its abandoned state, there was a sense of foreboding in the air. As Drake rummaged through the papers on the desk, Jonathan's eyes caught a strange indentation on the floorboards. "Drake," he called out, gesturing to the uneven paneling. Drake quickly retrieved a knife and pried open the hidden compartment. Inside lay a ledger, its pages filled with cryptic entries, names, dates, and payments. Jonathan pointed to a column. "These names, they are all high-ranking figures in London society. And these payments," Drake murmured, tracing his finger down the list. "Bribes. Cover-ups. This isn't just an organization, it's a network of manipulation." As they deciphered the ledger, a chilling realization emerged. Each victim had been associated with this shadowy group, but they had either refused to comply or threatened to expose its dealings. The bleeding mask wasn't merely a grotesque calling card. It was a symbol of punishment for betrayal. "Whoever controls this group," Drake said, his voice barely above a whisper, "has eyes and ears everywhere. We're dealing with something far more sinister than we imagined." Suddenly, a noise echoed from the hallway, a faint creak of floorboards. Both men froze. Drake gestured for silence as he reached for his revolver. Jonathan extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. "Drake," Jonathan whispered, "we're being watched." Drake's jaw tightened. "Then let's give them a show they'll never forget." The unseen threat lurking beyond the door signaled that the trail they followed had not gone unnoticed. For the first time, Drake and Jonathan realized they were not merely uncovering a conspiracy, they were now deeply entangled in it. Chapter 4. A Whisper in the Dark. The night was eerily silent as Alaric Drake and Jonathan Harker waited in a dimly lit alley behind the bustling docks of London. The faint sound of lapping water against wooden piers mixed with the occasional creak of a ship's hull. Despite the calm exterior, an undercurrent of tension hung heavy in the air. Drake glanced at his pocket watch. "Our informant is late," he muttered, his sharp eyes scanning the shadowed corners of the alley. Jonathan shifted uneasily. "Do you think he'll show? Or is this another trap?" Before Drake could respond, a figure emerged from the mist, a wiry man with a hunched posture, his face obscured by the brim of a tattered hat. He moved with cautious, jittery steps, glancing over his shoulder as though he feared being followed. "Mr. Drake," the man rasped, his voice barely audible. "I don't have much time." "They are watching." Drake's expression remained calm, but his voice carried an edge of authority. "Who's watching, Mr. Lark? Tell us what you know." The informant, Henry Lark, hesitated, his eyes darting to the shadows. "The bleeding mask, it's not just a symbol. It's a warning from an organization older than you think. They call themselves the Silent Accord." Jonathan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do they want? Why kill these people?" Lark's hand trembled as he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. "I've written down the locations of their meeting places, those I know of, at least. But you must be careful. They'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Drake reached for the paper, but before he could grasp it, a sharp whistling sound pierced the air. Lark's body jolted violently, and he crumpled to the ground, the paper fluttering from his hand. Jonathan gasped, his eyes darting to the rooftops. "A sniper!" Drake grabbed the paper and pulled Jonathan behind a stack of crates as another shot rang out, splintering the wood near their heads. "Stay low," he barked, his revolver drawn. The duo maneuvered through the labyrinth of crates and barrels, the gunfire chasing them at every turn. The assailant remained unseen, blending seamlessly into the foggy night. Finally, they burst into a side street, panting and disheveled but alive. Drake unfolded the paper, its contents revealing a list of cryptic symbols and 3 addresses scattered across London. Jonathan glanced over his shoulder, his voice shaky. "Whoever this Silent Accord is, they are not just organized, they are ruthless." Drake's jaw tightened, his mind racing. "And now they know we're on their trail." The death of Henry Lark left more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: the Silent Accord was no ordinary secret society. With every step deeper into the mystery, Drake and Jonathan found themselves teetering on the edge of a deadly game, one where shadows whispered of betrayal and every move could be their last. Chapter 5: The Collector of Masks. The air was thick with the pungent scent of varnish and aged leather as Alaric Drake and Jonathan Harker stepped into the dimly lit workshop. The flickering light of a single oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the cluttered room. Shelves lined with ornate masks of every shape and color towered above them, creating an eerie audience of frozen faces. At the center of the chaos sat an old man hunched over a workbench. His gnarled fingers moved deftly, carving intricate patterns into the surface of a half-finished mask. The man's gaunt face, partially obscured by a magnifying monocle, turned toward them as the door creaked shut. "You're not here for carnival masks," the man rasped, his voice dry as parchment. "Only those with dark intentions seek me out these days." Drake stepped forward, his tone firm but respectful. "Mr. Elias Garrick, I presume. We're here about the bleeding masks. Your work has drawn the attention of more than a few dangerous individuals." Garrick stiffened at the mention of the bleeding masks, his hand trembling slightly before he set his tools down. "The bleeding masks," he muttered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I should have never created them." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Drake before pressing gently. "What can you tell us about them? Why are they so significant?" Garrick hesitated, as though weighing the consequences of his words. Finally, he sighed and gestured for them to sit on 2 rickety chairs near his workbench. "The masks were commissioned by a man who called himself Dorian Kane," Garrick began. "He paid me handsomely and provided precise instructions. The design, the materials, even the hidden compartments." "Hidden compartments?" Drake's sharp eyes narrowed. Garrick nodded, pulling a dusty box from beneath his workbench. Inside was a mask identical to the ones found at the crime scenes. "Hey," he said, pointing to the inside of the mask. With a deft movement, he pressed a nearly invisible latch, revealing a tiny compartment in the forehead. Jonathan leaned in, astonished. What would fit in there? A note. Exactly, Garrick replied grimly. Each mask was designed to carry a message, coded, I suspect. But I never asked questions. By the time I realized the true purpose of my work, it was too late. People had already died. Drake examined the mask, his mind piecing together fragments of the mystery. And this Dorian Kane, did you ever learn more about him? Where he might be found? Garrick shook his head. He was a ghost. No address, no real name. But there's one thing I do know. He carried a symbol, a pendant shaped like an Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. It's an emblem of the Silent Accord. Jonathan's voice dropped to a whisper. The Silent Accord again. They are everywhere. Garrick's hands fidgeted as his voice turned desperate. I've told you all I know, but please, leave me out of this. I'm an old man with no stomach for danger. If they find out I've spoken to you. Drake stood, placing a reassuring hand on the mask maker's shoulder. You've done the right thing, Mr. Garrick. We'll make sure your name doesn't come up. As they left the workshop, the weight of Garrick's revelations hung heavy between them. The masks weren't just symbols, they were tools of a much larger conspiracy. Jonathan broke the silence. Do you think this Dorian Kane is the mastermind? Drake's expression darkened. He's a piece of the puzzle, but the real mastermind is still out there. And whoever they are playing a very dangerous game. The whispers of the Silent Accord grew louder in Drake's mind. Each step forward brought him closer to the heart of the mystery, and deeper into its shadows. Chapter 6. The Enigma of the Crimson Society. A biting wind swept through the cobblestone streets as Alaric Drake and Jonathan Harker approached the imposing gates of Blackthorn Manor. The grand estate loomed in the distance, its shadowy spires piercing the night sky like ominous sentinels. An invitation had arrived earlier that day, a cryptic note sealed with a crimson wax emblem depicting a serpent eating its tail, the unmistakable symbol of the Silent Accord. The Crimson Society, Drake murmured, studying the intricate design on the seal. A shadowy cabal operating in the upper echelons of society. If there's any truth to Garrick's claims, this is where our answers lie. Jonathan shifted uneasily. And if it's a trap? Drake's lips curled into a faint smirk. Then we'll give them a reason to regret underestimating us. The gates creaked open as they approached, and a uniformed butler greeted them with an air of rehearsed politeness. This way, gentlemen, he said, leading them through the lavishly decorated halls of Blackthorn Manor. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, and the walls were adorned with paintings of grim-faced aristocrats, their eyes seeming to follow the newcomers as they passed. At last, they entered a grand salon where a group of masked figures awaited, seated in a semicircle around a roaring fireplace. Each mask was unique, some ornate, others grotesque, but all bore the same crimson tint. Welcome, a voice called from the shadows. A tall figure stepped forward, his mask shaped like a snarling wolf. You've come seeking the Crimson Society, and here we are. But be warned, knowledge comes at a price. Drake's piercing gaze met the wolf-masked leaders. I'm more than willing to pay, provided the information is worth the cost. Tell me about the bleeding masks and Dorian Kane. A murmur rippled through the group, but the leader silenced them with a raised hand. Dorian Kane was one of us, he admitted. A gifted manipulator, a strategist without equal. But his ambitions grew unchecked. He sought to use our society as a weapon for his own ends, leveraging our secrets to sow chaos. We cast him out. Jonathan frowned. And yet, your symbol was found on the bleeding masks. Are you saying Kane is acting independently? Precisely, the leader replied. But his actions still pose a threat to us. The Silent Accord cannot tolerate such insubordination. He must be stopped. Drake folded his arms. Convenient for you to pin this all on a rogue member. But why should I trust you? For all I know, the Crimson Society is complicit in these crimes. The wolf-masked leader chuckled darkly. Trust is irrelevant, detective. What matters is our shared interest in ending Kane's reign of terror. I'll give you one lead, a name, Evelyn March. She was his confidant, his right hand. If anyone knows his current whereabouts, it's her. The room seemed to hold its breath as Drake considered the information. Finally, he nodded. Very well. But know this. If I find evidence that your society has blood on its hands, I won't hesitate to bring you down. The masked figures remained silent, their enigmatic gazes fixed on the duo as they exited the manor. Once outside, Jonathan exhaled deeply. Evelyn March. Do you think she's still loyal to Kane? Drake's expression was unreadable. We'll soon find out. But one thing is certain, the deeper we dig, the more dangerous this game becomes. As they vanished into the night, the echoes of the Crimson Society lingered behind them, a sinister reminder of the veiled forces at play. Chapter 7, Jonathan's Discovery. The scent of damp parchment filled the air as Jonathan Harker sat alone in the dimly lit library of an abandoned townhouse. Drake had instructed him to scour the old property, once owned by a disgraced member of the Crimson Society, while he pursued another lead. The walls, lined with crumbling bookshelves, seemed to whisper secrets of their own as Jonathan dug through drawers and overturned furniture in search of anything valuable. A flicker of moonlight illuminated the corner of an ornate desk, its surface scratched and scarred. Jonathan's eyes caught on a peculiar drawer with no visible handle. Intrigued, he ran his fingers along the edges, finding a hidden latch. With a satisfying click, the drawer slid open, revealing a slim leather-bound ledger tucked beneath a layer of dust. "What do we have here?" Jonathan muttered, pulling it free and carefully flipping it open. The pages were filled with meticulously handwritten entries, detailing financial transactions that spanned years. Each entry was coded with initials, dates, and payments. But as he scanned further, Jonathan's pulse quickened. The amounts were staggering, the recipients powerful individuals in society. Judges, politicians, high-ranking law enforcement, all receiving payments funneled through anonymous accounts. And then he saw it, a name he recognized. Dorian Kane, he whispered, his throat tightening. The ledger contained not only Kane's name, but also details of his dealings with the Crimson Society. Payments marked as contributions were tied to bribes, blackmail, and orchestrated disappearances. A creak from the floorboards above snapped Jonathan out of his thoughts. His heart pounded as he extinguished his lantern, plunging the room into darkness. Footsteps echoed faintly, growing louder with each passing second. Whoever was upstairs wasn't alone. Jonathan clutched the ledger tightly and pressed himself against the wall, inching toward the doorway. As shadows danced on the staircase, he spotted the glint of a weapon. The intruders were armed. "Search everywhere," a gruff voice commanded. "He has to be here. If he's got the ledger, the boss won't forgive us." Jonathan's breath caught. They were after the same document, and if they found him, there'd be no mercy. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jonathan slipped through the doorway and crept toward the back of the house. The boards beneath him groaned softly, but the intruders were too focused on their search to notice. As he reached a side window, he carefully pried it open and slipped into the alley beyond. Once outside, he ran. The cold night air burned his lungs, but he didn't stop until he reached the rendezvous point where Drake was waiting. Drake turned sharply as Jonathan approached, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the younger man's disheveled appearance. "What happened?" Jonathan held up the ledger, his hands trembling. "I found this. It's a record of everything, bribes, betrayals, and Kane's dealings with the Crimson Society. But someone else was there. They were looking for it too." Drake's gaze hardened as he took the ledger and flipped through its pages. "This changes everything," he said grimly. "We're not just dealing with a killer, Jonathan. We've stumbled onto a conspiracy that runs far deeper than we imagined." Jonathan nodded, his fear mingling with determination. "What do we do now?" Drake's expression was resolute. "We expose them. But first, we find Evelyn March. She may hold the key to unraveling this entire web." As the duo set off into the night, the ledger tucked securely in Drake's coat, the stakes of their investigation had never been higher. Chapter 8, Shadows over Westminster. The stately halls of Westminster echoed with hushed conversations and the click of polished boots against marble floors. Alaric Drake stood at the edge of the Grand Rotunda, his sharp eyes scanning the gathering of London's most influential figures. Draped in power and privilege, the elite of the city carried an air of confidence, yet Drake could sense an undercurrent of unease rippling through the room. "We're entering a den of vipers," Jonathan muttered, standing at Drake's side. His gaze shifted nervously between the opulent chandeliers and the glistening wine glasses in the hands of noblemen and politicians. "Indeed," Drake replied, his voice low. "But vipers often betray their nests. We'll find what we need." Their investigation had taken an unexpected turn when the names in the ledger pointed to figures who not only held sway in London, but operated in the shadows to preserve their power. Among them were members of parliament, influential businessmen, and even law enforcement officials. Drake and Jonathan had secured an invitation to a lavish gala under false pretenses, posing as distant associates of a prominent lord. The goal was simple but dangerous: gather information and observe the players. As the evening unfolded, Drake's instincts guided him toward Lord Edgar Hawthorne, a charismatic but secretive man whose name appeared multiple times in the incriminating ledger. Hawthorne held court near the fireplace, surrounded by admirers. His laughter boomed, but his eyes held a guarded gleam. "Keep close, Jonathan," Drake murmured before striding confidently toward the group. "Ah, Mr. Drake," Hawthorne greeted, his tone measured. "I hear you're a man of unique talents. Tell me, what brings you to this little soiree?" Drake offered a polite smile. "Curiosity, my lord. I've heard this gathering is the heart of London's intellect and influence. A man like me could only hope to learn from such company." Hawthorne chuckled, his gaze narrowing slightly. "Flattery will get you everywhere, my dear fellow. But beware, knowledge can be a dangerous thing in the wrong hands." The subtle threat wasn't lost on Drake, but he maintained his composure. "Danger often accompanies truth, my lord. It's a risk worth taking." Meanwhile, Jonathan wandered toward a quieter corner, pretending to admire a portrait of Queen Victoria. His sharp ears caught fragments of conversation between two men discussing an upcoming vote in Parliament, a vote tied to lucrative contracts and whispered promises. What are they hiding? Jonathan thought, leaning in just enough to catch a name: Evelyn March. The mention of Evelyn, the elusive key to their investigation, sent a jolt through him. He quickly scribbled a note in his pocketbook, careful not to draw attention. As the night wore on, Drake managed to extract subtle hints from Hawthorne about a clandestine meeting happening the following evening, a gathering of the Crimson Society's inner circle. When Drake and Jonathan finally left the gala, stepping into the cold London fog, their minds buzzed with the pieces of the puzzle they had gathered. "Evelyn March," Jonathan said, showing Drake his notes. "Her name came up in a conversation. She's tied to the contracts and the society." Drake's expression darkened. "Then we must find her before they do. And tomorrow's meeting may give us the opportunity we need." As the duo walked through the empty streets, Westminster loomed behind them, a symbol of power, privilege, and the dark secrets lurking in its shadow. Chapter 9: The Mask of Betrayal. The air in Drake's study was thick with tension, the scent of candle wax mingling with the faint aroma of aged leather. Alaric Drake sat motionless in his high-backed chair, his piercing eyes fixed on the figure standing before him. Across the room, Jonathan Harker watched the scene unfold, a growing sense of unease tightening his chest. The man they had invited to this clandestine meeting was none other than Inspector Harold Whitmore, a longtime confidant and ally in Drake's many investigations. Whitmore's sharp features were shadowed in the flickering candlelight, but his usual air of authority seemed to falter under Drake's scrutinizing gaze. "Harold," Drake began, his tone measured, "you've been with me through countless cases, some of the most baffling mysteries London has ever faced. But this time, something doesn't add up." Whitmore shifted uneasily, his gloved hands clenching at his sides. "I don't understand, Drake. Why summon me here like this? You know I've always had your back." Drake leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "That's precisely why this pains me. The ledger Jonathan uncovered ties you to the Crimson Society. Your name, your signature. Care to explain?" Jonathan's stomach sank as Whitmore's expression shifted. For a fleeting moment, guilt flashed in the inspector's eyes before he schooled his features into a mask of indignation. "That's preposterous," Whitmore snapped. "I've spent years fighting corruption in this city. You think I'd align myself with murderers and secret societies?" Drake's voice was calm but unyielding. "Then help me understand. Why does the Crimson Society's funding route through accounts you control? And why did Evelyn March, the woman we've been searching for, make multiple visits to your office before she disappeared?" Whitmore's face turned pale. She came to me for protection. I thought I could shield her from danger, but..." His voice trailed off, and he turned away, his shoulders slumping. "But what?" Drake pressed, rising from his chair. Whitmore hesitated, then finally spoke. his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize how deep they'd gotten to me. They threatened my family, Drake. My wife, my daughter. They said if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't turn a blind eye, they'd pay the price. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice sharp. So, you helped them? Allowed innocent people to die because you were too afraid to fight back. Whitmore turned, his eyes filled with anguish. You don't understand what it's like to have your family in their crosshairs. I thought I could outmaneuver them, gather enough evidence to bring them down. But they are everywhere, Drake. They see everything. Drake's expression was unreadable, but his voice carried a weight that silenced the room. You may have started with noble intentions, Harold, but fear has made you complicit. The blood of their victims stains your hands as much as theirs. Whitmore's head hung low, his guilt evident. What do you want from me, Alaric? Arrest me? Expose me to the world? Drake's eyes glinted with a mix of determination and sorrow. No. I want you to help us dismantle this society from within. You still have access, knowledge we can use. But if you betray me again, Harold, there will be no forgiveness. Whitmore looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. You have my word. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Drake, his own doubts lingering. Trusting Whitmore was a gamble, but one they couldn't afford to ignore. As the inspector left, disappearing into the foggy London night, Drake turned to Jonathan. Keep an eye on him. If he wavers, if he so much as hesitates. Jonathan nodded grimly. I'll be ready. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also brought them closer to the truth. The Crimson Society's web was unraveling, and Drake knew the battle ahead would demand every ounce of cunning and resolve he possessed. Chapter 10, A Deadly Warning. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy fog that clung to London's streets, casting long shadows over Alaric Drake's office. Jonathan Harker was seated by the window, absently flipping through a set of notes, when the sound of footsteps echoed up the staircase. Moments later, Mrs. Hartwell, Drake's loyal housekeeper, appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Sir, a package arrived. It's addressed to you. I thought it peculiar, so I brought it straight up. Drake looked up from his desk, his sharp eyes narrowing. Bring it here, Mrs. Hartwell. And thank you, leave it with me. The package was small, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with coarse twine. There was no return address, only the name Alaric Drake scrawled in an uneven hand. Jonathan set aside his notes and stood, a chill creeping over him as he watched Drake carefully examine the package. It could be a trap, Jonathan said, his voice tense. Should we call for the constables? Drake shook his head, retrieving a small knife from his desk drawer. No, Jonathan. If someone sent this to me, it's meant as a message. We need to see what it says. With surgical precision, Drake sliced through the twine and unfolded the paper. Inside lay a mask, identical to the bleeding masks they had seen before. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare into Drake's soul, and its once pristine surface was streaked with crimson, the same eerie substance as before. A folded note was pinned to the mask's forehead. Drake plucked it free, his expression darkening as he read the jagged handwriting. The hunter becomes the hunted. Your meddling has gone too far, Drake. If you wish to save your life, abandon this case. You've been warned. Jonathan leaned over Drake's shoulder to read the note, his blood running cold. They are targeting you now. This isn't just a threat. It's a challenge. Drake placed the note down carefully, his face an unreadable mask of calm. It's more than that, Jonathan. This is their way of reminding me that they are always watching, always one step ahead. But they've made a mistake. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. What mistake? Drake gestured to the mask, pointing out a faint mark etched into the inner rim, an engraving too small to be noticed at first glance. This symbol, it's the same insignia we found in the ledger. Whoever sent this is connected to the Crimson Society. Jonathan studied the symbol, a serpent coiled around a dagger, and frowned. Then why warn you? If they want you dead, why not simply strike? Drake's lips curved into a grim smile. Because fear is their weapon. They thrive on intimidation, on making their enemies second-guess themselves. But fear can be a double-edged sword, Jonathan. They've shown their hand too early. Despite Drake's confidence, Jonathan couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. We need to increase precautions. If they are willing to target you directly, who knows what lengths they'll go to next. Drake nodded. Agreed. We'll take every precaution, but we won't stop. If they think this will deter me, they've underestimated my resolve. As the two men deliberated their next move, the bleeding mask sat ominously on the desk, a harbinger of the peril that loomed over them. Drake stood, his voice resolute. The game has shifted, Jonathan. They've drawn me into their sights, but they've also made a fatal error. They think they can scare me into submission. Let's show them how wrong they are. With those words, the hunt for the Crimson Society intensified. The predator had become the prey, but Alaric Drake was no ordinary target. He was a man determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 11: The Crypt of Whispers. The damp air in the hidden catacombs beneath London's cobbled streets carried a stench of decay and mildew. The faint glow of Drake's lantern flickered against the damp walls, casting eerie shadows that danced like ghosts of the past. Jonathan Harker followed closely, his every footstep echoing faintly in the confined space. "Are you certain this is the place?" Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant dripping of water. Drake paused, holding up the map they had discovered in the Crimson Society's ledger. The symbols aligned perfectly with the old plans of the city. This chamber was deliberately hidden centuries ago. Whatever lies here, it's what they've been protecting. As they turned a corner, a heavy iron door loomed before them, its surface etched with the serpentine dagger insignia of the Crimson Society. Jonathan's breath hitched. That symbol again. This has to be it. Drake crouched before the door, inspecting it closely. His fingers traced the intricate carvings. A lock of this design isn't merely mechanical, it's a puzzle, meant to deter intruders. "Stand back, Jonathan. This could take time." Jonathan stepped away, gripping a crowbar just in case. As Drake worked on the lock, the oppressive silence of the crypt seemed to close in around them. The flickering lantern made the shadows appear alive, and Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. Drake pushed the door open, and a chilling draft swept past them. Inside, the chamber was vast and lined with rows of shelves, each laden with documents, masks, and strange artifacts. At the center stood a stone table, atop which rested a blood-red journal bound in leather. Drake approached the table cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for traps. "This is it, Jonathan. The heart of their secrets." Jonathan followed, his eyes wide with wonder and dread. "What is all this?" Drake picked up the journal and flipped through its pages. The entries were written in a cryptic script, but some pages contained names and dates, entries that chronicled decades of clandestine operations. This journal connects every victim to the Crimson Society's plans. It's a ledger of their crimes, Jonathan. Murders, extortions, blackmail, it's all here. As they scanned the contents, a faint sound echoed through the crypt, like the shuffle of footsteps. Jonathan froze, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "Drake, we're not alone." Drake placed the journal in his bag, his voice calm but firm. "Stay close. If they've followed us here, they won't let us leave easily." The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint scrape of metal against stone. The flickering lantern revealed no figures, but the oppressive feeling of being hunted was undeniable. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the shadows, low and menacing. "You should have stayed away, Mr. Drake. Curiosity will be your downfall." Drake turned, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "If you wish to stop me, then step forward and face me. Hiding in the shadows only proves your cowardice." There was a pause, followed by cold laughter. "You've unearthed what was meant to stay buried. You'll find that knowledge often comes with a price." Before they could respond, the room plunged into chaos. A hidden mechanism was triggered, and the walls began to tremble. Stones shifted, and dust filled the air. "Jonathan, run!" Drake shouted, grabbing his companion by the arm. Together, they bolted through the crypt, the journal clutched tightly in Drake's hands. Behind them, the crypt began to collapse, the secrets of the Crimson Society threatening to be buried forever. As they emerged into the open air, coughing and gasping for breath, Drake turned back to the hidden entrance, now sealed by rubble. Jonathan leaned against a wall, his face pale. "We barely made it." That voice, they knew we were there. Drake nodded, his expression grim. "They tried to silence us, but they failed. This journal is the key to unraveling their web of lies." We've uncovered their secrets, Jonathan. Now, we bring them into the light. With the journal in hand, the duo knew the stakes had risen. The Crimson Society wouldn't stop until their secrets were protected, but Drake and Jonathan were more determined than ever to bring them down. Chapter 12. The Lurking Phantom. The streets of London seemed darker that night, the gas lamps casting long, distorted shadows that flickered ominously. Drake and Jonathan, armed with the incriminating journal, walked briskly through the narrow alleys, their senses heightened. The weight of their discovery hung heavy in the air, and with each step, they felt the presence of unseen eyes tracking their every move. "Do you feel it too?" Jonathan whispered, clutching the strap of the satchel holding the journal. Drake's eyes scanned the shadows, his voice low. "Yes, we're being followed. Stay close and act natural. Whoever it is, they'll reveal themselves soon enough." As they rounded a corner into a quieter street, a faint sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Drake abruptly stopped, turning sharply, but the alley behind them was empty save for the distant hum of the city. "They are skilled," Drake muttered, "but they'll have to get closer if they want to act." Jonathan shivered, his nerves fraying under the pressure. "And what happens when they do?" Drake smirked faintly. "Then we turn the tables." As they approached a bridge spanning a narrow canal, the air grew colder, and the atmosphere thickened with tension. Jonathan glanced over his shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, he saw it, a shadowy figure moving stealthily along the rooftops. "Drake!" Jonathan hissed. "There, on the roof!" Drake's eyes darted upward, catching a glimpse of the figure before it vanished into the darkness. "They are toying with us, trying to intimidate." But intimidation only works on the unprepared. Before Jonathan could respond, a sudden clang echoed through the alley. From the shadows, the figure emerged, a tall, cloaked individual with a featureless mask that gleamed faintly in the dim light. In their hand was a long, thin blade that glinted menacingly. "You should have left the journal where it belonged," the figure said, their voice distorted and hollow. "Now you've made yourselves targets." Drake stepped forward, his demeanor calm and resolute. "If you're here to silence us, you've made a grave mistake. You should know I'm not easily intimidated." The figure tilted their head, as if amused. "Confidence is admirable, but it won't save you." In a sudden blur of motion, the masked figure lunged at Drake. Anticipating the attack, Drake sidestepped deftly, grabbing a discarded metal rod from the ground to parry the blade. Sparks flew as metal clashed against metal. "Jonathan, get out of here!" Drake shouted, his voice commanding. But Jonathan stood frozen, torn between fear and loyalty. His grip tightened on the satchel, unwilling to abandon the journal to their pursuer. The masked figure moved with unnatural speed, their strikes precise and relentless. Drake, however, matched their agility, using his quick reflexes and strategic mind to anticipate the attacks. "Who sent you?" Drake demanded as he blocked another strike. "The Crimson Society? Or are you working alone?" The figure didn't answer, their silence more unnerving than any response. With a sudden, powerful swing, they disarmed Drake, sending the rod clattering to the ground. As the figure raised their blade for a final strike, Jonathan acted. Summoning every ounce of courage, he hurled the satchel at the masked figure, knocking them off balance. The journal tumbled out, landing in a puddle nearby. The distraction gave Drake the opening he needed. With swift precision, he tackled the figure, pinning them to the ground. The mask slipped slightly, revealing a pair of sharp, piercing eyes filled with malice. "Who are you?" Drake demanded, pressing the figure down. "Why are you protecting the Crimson Society?" The figure let out a low, sinister laugh. "You think this ends with me? You've only scratched the surface of their power. They are everywhere, Drake. And they are watching." Before Drake could extract more information, the figure activated a hidden mechanism on their wrist. A blinding flash filled the alley, and when the light faded, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint scent of sulfur in their wake. Jonathan stumbled forward, retrieving the journal from the puddle. "Are you all right, Drake?" Drake stood slowly, his expression grim. "I'm fine, but this changes everything. They are more organized than we thought, and far more dangerous." Jonathan nodded, his hands trembling. "What now?" Drake took the journal, wiping it carefully. "Now we press on. They wanted to scare us into submission. Instead, they've shown us how close we're getting to the truth." The duo walked away, their resolve stronger than ever. But as they disappeared into the night, a pair of unseen eyes watched from the shadows, silently vowing that the next encounter would not end in failure. Chapter 13. The Mastermind's Play. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Drake's study, casting a golden hue over the scattered papers, maps, and sketches that covered the large oak table. Jonathan sat opposite him, his face etched with fatigue, while Drake's piercing eyes studied the evidence with relentless intensity. "I'm telling you, there's a pattern here," Drake said, tracing a line across a map of London with his finger. Red pins marked the locations of each victim, creating what seemed to be a chaotic spread across the city. But Drake's expression suggested otherwise. Jonathan frowned, sipping his now-cold tea. "We've been over this a dozen times, Drake. The murders seem random, different neighborhoods, no apparent connection between the victims." Drake interrupted, his tone sharp. "No. Look closer. It's not random, it's deliberate. These locations form a sequence, but it's not geographical. It's symbolic." Jonathan leaned in, his skepticism giving way to curiosity. "Symbolic? How so?" Drake picked up a piece of paper, covered with hastily scribbled notes. Each location aligns with the victims' professions and the way they were killed. The poet murdered at the theater, the banker found near the stock exchange, the mask maker in his workshop. It's as if the killer is creating a story, an elaborate narrative with each murder as a chapter. Jonathan's eyes widened as he began to see the connections Drake described. "So, the mastermind is orchestrating these murders to send a message?" "Precisely," Drake said, his voice tight with urgency. "And the message isn't meant for us, it's meant for the society. The Crimson Society." Jonathan shuddered at the name. The shadowy organization had loomed over their investigation like a dark cloud, its influence vast and its members shrouded in secrecy. Drake continued, his voice growing more intense. "The victims, Jonathan, they are not random. Each of them had ties to the Crimson Society. Some were members, others, dissenters. The killings are a purge, a warning to anyone who dares to betray the group." Jonathan's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. But why the masks? And why the elaborate theatrics? Drake's jaw tightened. The masks are more than just a calling card. They are a symbol of anonymity, of secrecy. The blood, it's a representation of betrayal. Whoever the mastermind is, they are playing a deadly game, and the masks are their way of asserting control. As Drake spoke, a memory surfaced in Jonathan's mind. "Wait, what about the ledger we found? It had a list of names, most of which were crossed out. Could those be targets?" Drake nodded grimly. "Exactly. The names on that list are a roadmap to the mastermind's plan. If we can figure out who's next, we might be able to stop the next murder and draw the mastermind out of the shadows." Jonathan stood abruptly, a sense of urgency propelling him. "Then let's not waste any time. We need to find out who the remaining names are and how they are connected." Drake grabbed his coat, his mind already calculating their next move. "We'll start with the ledger and cross-reference it with the victims. And we need to keep an eye on anyone who fits the pattern. They'll likely be the next target." As they left the study, a cold wind swept through the streets of London, carrying with it the ominous sense that time was running out. Unbeknownst to the duo, a figure watched from a nearby rooftop, their face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. The figure smirked, their voice a low whisper. "You're clever, Drake. But cleverness won't save you from what's coming. The final move is mine." Drake and Jonathan pressed forward, unaware that the mastermind had already set their next trap in motion. The clock was ticking, and the game was far from over. Chapter 14. Web of Lies. The grand hall of the abandoned manor echoed with faint whispers as Drake and Jonathan entered. It was a meeting place once owned by a known member of the Crimson Society, now shrouded in mystery and dust. Dim light from their lanterns revealed faded tapestries and broken furniture, relics of a forgotten time. "This is it," Jonathan said in a low voice, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. "Our informant said the society used this place for their clandestine gatherings." Drake nodded, his expression unreadable. "Let's hope they are more forthcoming than the last one." As if on cue, a door creaked open, and a gaunt man in a tattered coat stepped into the light. His hollow eyes darted nervously between Drake and Jonathan. "You're late," the man whispered, his voice trembling. We're here now, Drake replied calmly. Let's talk. The man hesitated before sitting at the edge of a crumbling chair. They are watching me, he muttered. They watch everyone. If they find out I'm talking to you. They won't, Drake assured him. But we need answers. Start with the Crimson Society. Who's behind the killings? The man hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. The society is splintering. There are factions within it now. Some are loyal to the old ways, secrecy, influence. But others, they've grown restless. They want power, dominance. The killings are their way of sending a message. Jonathan frowned. But why target their own? Why the masks and theatrics? The man hesitated again, then whispered, to instill fear. To root out dissenters. They want loyalty or death. The bleeding masks. They are a symbol of betrayal. Before Drake could press further, the man flinched, his head snapping toward the door. They are here, he hissed. I can't stay, if they catch me. Drake grabbed his arm firmly. Who's leading them? Who's the mastermind? The man's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. You don't understand. The Crimson Society isn't led by one person. It's a network, a web. Even its members don't know who controls it. Before Drake could ask more, the man broke free and bolted toward the door. Wait! Jonathan shouted. But it was too late. The duo gave chase. But as they reached the corridor, a muffled cry echoed through the manor, followed by an eerie silence. They found the informant crumpled on the floor, his lifeless body bathed in the glow of their lanterns. A bleeding mask lay beside him. Jonathan shivered. They were watching him. Just like he said, Drake's face was a mask of grim determination. And now they know we're getting close. As they stood over the informant's body, Drake noticed something in the man's hand, a crumpled note. Carefully, he pried it free and read its contents. The truth lies within the lies, he murmured. What does that mean? Jonathan glanced over his shoulder, his voice tense. It means they are playing us, Drake. Every clue, every testimony, it's all part of their game. Drake pocketed the note, his mind racing. Then we'll play it better. Let's go. We're not done yet. The manor grew silent once more as the duo left, the weight of deception and danger pressing heavily on their shoulders. The Crimson Society's web of lies was growing tighter, but Drake and Jonathan were determined to unravel it, no matter the cost. Chapter 15. A Trail of Blood. The chilling wind swept through London's cobbled streets, carrying with it the metallic tang of impending dread. As dawn broke over the fog-drenched city, a constable's whistle echoed, summoning curious onlookers to a grisly scene. Detective Alaric Drake arrived at the riverfront, his coat billowing in the gusts. Jonathan Harker was already there, pacing near the police perimeter. The pale morning light revealed the third victim, a prominent art dealer, sprawled lifeless on the cold stone docks. This one's different, Jonathan said, his voice tinged with unease. No mask, no theatrics. Just, he gestured to the victim, whose chest bore a crimson slash. Drake crouched beside the body, his keen eyes scanning the scene. The blood, still fresh, trailed away from the victim toward a narrow alley. It's a message, he muttered. The killer wants us to follow. Jonathan frowned. Follow? Into what? Another trap. Drake stood, his face grim. Likely. But we don't have the luxury of caution anymore. 3 lives lost, and the pattern is accelerating. The constables gave way as the duo followed the trail of blood into the labyrinthine alleys of the East End. Each step felt like a descent into the heart of darkness, the bloodstains leading them through twisting turns and dead ends. This isn't random, Drake observed, pausing to examine a smeared mark on a wall. The killer knows these streets. They are leading us somewhere specific. At the alley's end, they emerged into a derelict warehouse. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay and old wood. A single lantern swayed overhead, casting flickering shadows. What is this place? Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible. Drake pointed to the far wall, where a crude symbol was etched in dried blood, a crimson mask encircled by a serpent. It's a message, he said. The killer's signature, but more elaborate than before. Jonathan shivered. What does it mean? Drake's eyes narrowed. Control. Power. The serpent represents the Crimson Society, tightening its grip. But the absence of a mask on the victim suggests a shift in their motive. This isn't just about loyalty anymore. Before they could analyze further, a faint noise echoed through the warehouse, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on rotting wood. Drake motioned for silence, drawing his revolver. Jonathan followed, his heart pounding as they moved toward the source of the sound. Near the back of the warehouse, they found a figure slumped against a pillar. It was another victim, barely alive, clutching a blood-soaked piece of parchment. Drake knelt beside the man, who gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror. "Who did this to you?" Drake demanded, his voice urgent. The man struggled to speak, his words barely audible. They're everywhere, watching." Drake leaned closer as the man's trembling hand pressed the parchment into his palm. With his final breath, the victim whispered, "Beware the masquerade." As the man's body went limp, Drake unfolded the parchment. It contained a list of names, some crossed out, others circled. Jonathan peered over his shoulder, his eyes widening. "These are targets," he said, his voice shaking. "And look, your name's on it, Drake." Drake's jaw tightened. "Then we're not just chasing them anymore. We're part of their game." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their thoughts. The duo exchanged a glance before retreating into the shadows, their minds racing. The trail of blood had led them deeper into the Crimson Society's twisted web, and with each revelation, the stakes grew higher. Time was running out, and the next move could mean the difference between life and death. Chapter 16. The Bleeding Mask Unveiled. The night was heavy with tension as Drake and Jonathan prepared for their most dangerous encounter yet. The name at the top of the victims' list had led them to an opulent mansion on the outskirts of London, a place that seemed far removed from the grime and despair of the city streets. Yet, beneath its grandeur lay the heart of the Crimson Society's twisted operations. As they approached the gates, Jonathan muttered, "This feels too easy. If the mastermind is here, they are expecting us." Drake adjusted his revolver holster. "Let them. We're not leaving until we have answers." Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet. The grand chandelier cast long shadows on the marble floors, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of blood. Drake's sharp eyes caught a faint trail, footprints in drying crimson, that led deeper into the house. They followed the trail to a grand ballroom, its walls adorned with masks of every kind, from the ornate to the grotesque. At the center of the room stood a figure draped in a crimson cloak, their face obscured by a mask that dripped with blood-like streaks. "So, the great Detective Drake finally graces us with his presence," the figure said, their voice smooth yet chilling. Drake stepped forward, his revolver drawn. "Take off the mask. This ends tonight." The figure chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Ah, but the mask is the essence of my work, Detective. It hides the truth, reveals the lies, and binds the world in my design." Jonathan, his voice steady despite the tension, said, "You've killed innocent people, terrorized this city. For what? Power? Revenge?" The figure turned toward Jonathan. "Not revenge, dear boy. Justice." The so-called victims were far from innocent. Each played their part in the corruption that rots this city. They wore their own masks of virtue while exploiting the helpless. Drake's eyes narrowed. "And you decided you were the judge, jury, and executioner?" The figure laughed again, raising their hands. "Why not? Someone had to unmask them for what they truly were. Their blood was the ink to rewrite the story of London." Before Drake could respond, the figure pulled a lever hidden in the wall. The chandelier dimmed, and hidden doors slid open, revealing armed members of the Crimson Society. "Capture them," the figure commanded. Drake and Jonathan dove for cover as the society members closed in. Gunshots rang out, echoing through the grand room. Drake's sharp aim took down several attackers, while Jonathan fought with surprising agility, using his wits to disarm his foes. Amid the chaos, the masked figure attempted to slip away. Jonathan noticed and shouted, "Drake! They are escaping!" Drake pursued the figure through a hidden passage that led to a dimly lit library. There, under the flickering light of a single lamp, the figure finally stopped. "You can't stop this, Detective," the figure said, their voice strained. "Even if you kill me, the society will endure." Drake raised his revolver. "The society may endure, but your reign of terror ends here. Take off the mask. Show me who you really are." With a resigned sigh, the figure slowly removed the mask, revealing a familiar face, someone Drake had trusted in the upper echelons of London's elite. "You," Drake said, his voice laced with disbelief. The unmasked figure smiled coldly. Surprised? You shouldn't be. The greatest trick the Crimson Society ever pulled was convincing the world we didn't exist. Drake's grip on the revolver tightened. You'll answer for your crimes. Before Drake could act, the figure produced a hidden blade, lunging at him. A fierce struggle ensued, ending with the blade clattering to the floor and the figure subdued. As the authorities arrived, Drake handed the mastermind over, his expression grim. Jonathan, battered but unharmed, joined him. What happens now? Jonathan asked. Drake looked at the bleeding mask, now discarded and lifeless. The Society's secrets won't die easily, but we've cut off the head. Now we dismantle the rest. The case was far from over, but for the first time, a glimmer of hope pierced the darkness. The mastermind's twisted motives had been unveiled, and the masks of betrayal had finally been stripped away. Chapter 17. The Final Deception. The city of London buzzed with the illusion of calm, but Detective Drake knew better. The Crimson Society's mastermind, now behind bars, had uttered a chilling warning before their capture. You think it's over, but the grand finale has yet to come. Drake sat in his dimly lit office, studying the evidence scattered across his desk. The bleeding masks, the ledger of secrets, and the map they had discovered in the secret chamber all hinted at a larger, more insidious plan. Jonathan entered, his face pale as he handed Drake a newspaper. Read the headline, Jonathan said, his voice trembling. Drake glanced at the front page. Gala event at Westminster Hall tonight, celebrating the city's leaders. The mastermind's final play, Drake muttered. This gala will bring together the city's most powerful figures. If the Crimson Society has anything left, this is where they'll strike. As the clock ticked toward the gala's opening, Drake and Jonathan worked tirelessly, piecing together the clues. Among the documents, they uncovered a blueprint of Westminster Hall, with cryptic notations marking certain locations. These points, Jonathan said, tracing the markings, they align with structural supports. If someone wanted to collapse the hall, Drake's eyes darkened. Hundreds of lives, all the city's elite, wiped out in one move. We need to stop this now. That evening, Westminster Hall glittered under the glow of chandeliers. Guests arrived in their finest attire, unaware of the deadly scheme unfolding beneath their feet. Drake and Jonathan entered through a service door, blending in with the staff as they began their search for the hidden explosives. The atmosphere was tense as they moved through the crowd, scanning for anything suspicious. Then, amidst the chatter and laughter, Drake's sharp eye caught a figure slipping into a restricted area. Jonathan, follow me, Drake said, weaving through the throng of guests. They trailed the figure to the basement, where crates of explosives were being methodically placed around the hall's foundation. At the center of the operation stood a man in a crimson mask, issuing orders. You won't get away with this, Drake called out, his revolver drawn. The man turned, laughing. Ah, Detective Drake. Right on time for the grand finale, Jonathan whispered. That voice. He was at the mastermind's trial. He's one of their lieutenants. A tense standoff ensued, with the Crimson Society operatives outnumbering Drake and Jonathan. You don't have to do this, Drake said, his voice steady. Destroying lives won't bring justice, it'll only deepen the cycle of corruption. The masked man sneered. Spare me your morality, detective. This city thrives on lies and betrayal. Tonight, we cleanse it with fire. Suddenly, Jonathan lunged for the detonator in the man's hand. Chaos erupted as the operatives attacked, forcing Drake to fend them off while Jonathan wrestled for control of the device. Amid the struggle, an explosion rocked the basement, but it wasn't from the hall. Drake realized that Jonathan had triggered a small decoy charge, distracting the operatives and giving them a chance to escape. Upstairs, the gala continued as if nothing had happened. Drake and Jonathan, battered but undeterred, rushed to the main floor and pulled the fire alarm. As the guests evacuated, they confronted the Crimson Society's leader one final time. You lose, Drake said, pinning the masked man to the floor. The man laughed bitterly. Do I? You may have saved them tonight, but the society is everywhere. You can't stop what's already in motion. As the authorities arrived, Drake and Jonathan secured the explosives and handed over the captured operatives. Exhausted, they watched as Westminster Hall emptied, its grandeur intact but its secrets exposed. Jonathan broke the silence. Do you think this is really the end? Drake stared at the horizon, where the city lights flickered against the night sky. No, but it's the beginning of the end. And that's enough for now. Chapter 18, The Crimson Inferno. The scent of smoke hung heavy in the air, not from Drake's habitual cigarette, but from the burning embers crackling around the abandoned warehouse. He stood at the threshold, his sharp eyes scanning the dim interior for any sign of the mastermind. The message left at his office earlier was clear. Come alone, detective, if you dare. Drake dared. As he stepped inside, the oppressive heat wrapped around him. Rows of crates and barrels, likely filled with combustible materials, lined the walls. The flickering orange light from scattered fires danced across the space, casting ominous shadows. At the center of it all, sitting casually on an overturned crate, was the mastermind. The man, still wearing a crimson mask, exhaled a puff of smoke from a cigar clutched in his hand. Detective Drake, he drawled. Right on schedule. Do you always walk into traps so willingly? Drake's hand hovered near his coat pocket, where his revolver rested. Instead of reaching for it, he pulled out his pack of cigarettes, lighting one with deliberate slowness. The first inhale was grounding, a sharp contrast to the chaotic scene before him. I like to see who's laying the trap, Drake replied, blowing a thin stream of smoke into the charged air. And I have to say, you've got a flair for theatrics. Fire. Masks. A private invitation? You should have sent champagne. The mastermind laughed, a cold, echoing sound. You've always had wit, Drake. Shame it won't save you tonight. Drake's eyes darted around the warehouse, noting the strategic placement of incendiary devices. What's the plan? Blow this place sky high and take me with it? Or are you hoping I'll burn to death while you make your escape? The masked man gestured with his cigar. Neither, actually. You see, this isn't just about you. It's about a message. London has rotted from the inside, and it's time for a reckoning. You've been meddling in affairs far beyond your understanding, Drake. Tonight, the city burns. As the mastermind spoke, Drake inched closer, feigning casual interest. All this destruction for a message. A lot of people are going to die for your ideals. Do they even matter to you? The mastermind rose, tossing the cigar aside. I do what's necessary. The Crimson Society was born to cleanse corruption. But you, he pointed accusingly, you protect the very people poisoning this city. Drake dropped his cigarette to the floor, crushing it under his heel. I protect the law. And right now, the law says you're done. With a sudden lunge, Drake grabbed a metal rod from a nearby crate, swinging it at the mastermind's hand. The detonator he held clattered to the ground, sliding under a barrel. A fierce struggle erupted, the two men grappling amid the growing flames. You think you can stop this? The mastermind snarled, throwing a punch that grazed Drake's jaw. I've stopped worse, Drake shot back, slamming the rod against the man's arm, forcing him to stumble. As the fire intensified, the barrels around them began to hiss and pop. Smoke billowed, thick and suffocating. Drake felt his lungs protest, but he pressed on, his determination unyielding. The mastermind tried to crawl toward the detonator, but Drake tackled him, pinning him down. It's over, Drake growled, his voice hoarse from the smoke. The man beneath him laughed, even as his strength waned. You'll never stop the society. Even if I fall, there are others. We are everywhere. Good, Drake replied, pulling out his handcuffs. I like a challenge. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance as Drake hauled the mastermind to his feet. The warehouse was on the verge of collapse, flames licking at the walls. Jonathan burst through the entrance, coughing as he called out, Drake, we need to get out of here. Already on it, Drake replied, dragging the mastermind toward safety. As they stumbled into the cool night air, the warehouse erupted in a fiery explosion behind them. Drake lit another cigarette with shaky hands, watching the inferno consume the remnants of the Crimson Society's plans. Jonathan looked at him, his face a mixture of relief and concern. You all right? Drake took a long drag, exhaling slowly. Never better. One down, 100 to go. They watched the flames together, knowing the battle was far from over. But for tonight, they had won. Chapter 19, The Color of Justice. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back, their pens poised to capture every detail of the trial that had captivated the nation. The mastermind of the Crimson Society, unmasked and defiant, sat at the defendant's table, his steely gaze fixed on the judge. Drake leaned against the wall near the entrance, observing the proceedings with a cigarette dangling unlit between his fingers, a rare moment of restraint. Jonathan stood beside him, arms crossed, his expression tense. "Think they'll convict him?" Jonathan asked, breaking the heavy silence. Drake's eyes narrowed. "The evidence is ironclad. The ledger, the masks, the detonator. He's got nowhere to hide. But justice? That's another story." The trial had been grueling. The mastermind's legal team was ruthless, painting him as a misguided idealist rather than the cold, calculating killer he was. Witnesses trembled under cross-examination, their testimonies carefully dismantled. But the ledger Jonathan had uncovered, the hidden list of names, bribes, and crimes, was undeniable. When the prosecutor presented the bloody masks as the symbol of the crimes, a hush fell over the courtroom. "These masks," the prosecutor said, holding one aloft, "represent the lives taken, the fear instilled, and the chaos wrought upon our city. They are the face of guilt, and that guilt belongs to the accused." Drake's chest tightened as he watched the jury's reactions. He had seen the mastermind's cruelty up close, the calculated murders, the manipulation, the lives destroyed. But the fight for justice had come at a cost. Outside the courtroom, after the jury delivered a unanimous guilty verdict, Drake lit his cigarette and exhaled a cloud of smoke into the cold air. Jonathan joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "To justice," Jonathan said, handing Drake a cup. Drake smirked, taking the coffee. "Justice is messy, but this time, we got it right." Jonathan's face darkened. "At what cost, though? The victims, the lives we couldn't save." Drake stared at the streetlights, their glow blurring in the evening fog. "We do what we can, Jonathan. We stop the monsters we can reach. It's not perfect, but it's something." Later that night, back at his apartment, Drake pulled out the bleeding mask that had been addressed to him. It sat on his desk, a haunting reminder of how close he had come to becoming another victim. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion weighing him down. The Crimson Society was dismantled, but the scars it left on the city, and on him, would linger. Justice had been served, but the price was steep: sleepless nights, personal sacrifices, and the nagging fear that another threat would soon emerge. Drake poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light of his desk lamp. He raised his glass in a silent toast, not to victory, but to resilience, to the relentless pursuit of truth, and to the countless souls who would never see justice. As the night deepened, the mask seemed to watch him, a spectral reminder of the darkness he fought to keep at bay. Drake leaned back in his chair, cigarette smoke curling around him, and whispered to the silence, "The color of justice is red, and it's never truly washed away." Chapter 20, Reflections in Crimson. The rain fell softly over London, cleansing the cobblestone streets as dawn broke through the lingering fog. Drake sat at the corner booth of a quiet cafe, nursing his second cup of coffee. He stared out the window, watching the city come alive after the storm, yet his thoughts remained tethered to the darkness they had just left behind. Jonathan entered, shaking off the rain from his overcoat, and slid into the seat across from Drake. He carried a small leather-bound journal, its edges worn and pages slightly frayed. "You didn't go home," Jonathan remarked, nodding toward the half-empty coffee cup. Drake shrugged, lighting a cigarette. "Home feels empty after a case like this. Thought I'd wait here." Jonathan set the journal on the table. "I found this while we were packing up the evidence room." "It's yours." Drake frowned, eyeing the journal. "Didn't think I kept one of those." "You didn't," Jonathan replied, pushing it closer. "It's not for you. It's about you." The journal belonged to one of the victims, a young reporter who had been investigating the Crimson Society before her untimely death. Its pages were filled with sketches, notes, and reflections, her observations of Drake and Jonathan as they fought to uncover the truth. "She called you relentless," Jonathan said, flipping to a page. "Said you had the tenacity of a wolf and the soul of a poet, even if you hide it well." Drake smirked faintly but said nothing. "And me?" Jonathan asked, pretending to look offended. Drake took a long drag from his cigarette. "A young knight trying to save the world," Jonathan chuckled softly, but the weight of their shared experiences lingered between them. As the morning brightened, they reflected on the events that had brought them to this moment. The faces of the victims, the shadowy corridors, the whispered threats, and the haunting masks. They were imprinted on their memories. "Do you think it's over?" Jonathan asked, his voice quieter now. Drake stubbed out his cigarette, his gaze steady. "The Crimson Society is gone, but something else will rise to take its place. It always does." Jonathan leaned back, crossing his arms. "And us? We keep going," Drake said simply. "We keep fighting the shadows, one case at a time." As they left the cafe, the rain began to subside, leaving behind glistening streets and a faint rainbow arching over Westminster. For the first time in weeks, a sense of calm settled over them. Drake pulled his coat tighter against the lingering chill, glancing at Jonathan. "You're not bad company for a young knight, you know." Jonathan grinned. "And you're not as jaded as you pretend to be." The two walked side by side, their silhouettes blending into the bustling city, a duo forged by trials, strengthened by trust, and bound by a shared purpose. The case of the bleeding masks was over, but its echoes would remain. And so would they, steadfast in their pursuit of justice amidst the shadows of a restless city. As they disappeared into the crowd, the words from the journal lingered in Drake's mind. "Some fight for fame, some for fortune. But there are a rare few who fight simply because they must. Those are the ones who leave a mark, even when the world refuses to see it." This is the end of the story. Hope you enjoy. Please like and subscribe our channel. Thank you.